This is Dimitri Lascaris reporting from Athens, Greece on May 16, 2024. I'm standing across the street from the Israeli embassy in Greece, not far from central Athens. This was the site last night of a large protest involving thousands of people who came on foot from central Athens. At a certain point, according to press reports, I wasn't aware of the event and so I didn't actually attend it and learned of it after the fact, but according to press reports, at a certain point during the protest, as the protesters approached the embassy, a small number of them broke off and engaged in clashes with police, and there were a handful of arrests, people detained briefly at the site of the protest. And before anybody leaps to the conclusion that pro-Palestinian protesters in Greece are violent, I can tell you that there are quite frequent clashes between anarchists who participate in many of these protests and the police on a whole range of subjects. This is a time-honored tradition in Greece, and in fact, during the worst years of the austerity crisis, which never really ended in Greece, there were clashes that were far more severe and regular than what is reported to have taken place last night between those opposed to austerity, not only anarchists but many other segments of Greek society, and the police, who in Greece have tended to use quite brutal force to suppress dissent in recent years. In any event, the protest last night was preceded on the prior night by a brief occupation of the University of Athens Law School. And here's a little bit of what I saw when I visited the University of Athens Law School yesterday. There were no protesters there. The occupation apparently had ended, but they left their calling cards, so to speak, by leaving graffiti and messages of defiance all over the walls of the facility. So here's some of what I saw.
Και πλέον μετανάστριες στο εξωτερικό. Η γενιά του Αλέξη, του Παύλου και της Ζάκη. Γι' αυτό και η αντίσταση για μας είναι ανάγκη.
Now, as many of you will know, those of you who have been following my journalism for at least a few months now, I spent all of the month of April, I should say March, and the beginning of April in West Asia. And the purpose in my going there was to familiarize myself with people who were involved in some form of organized resistance against Israeli and American hegemony in West Asia. I started my trip in Qatar, where I attended a large weapons exhibition, mostly populated by weapons makers from the West. Then I went to Amman, Jordan, attended a protest by pro-Palestinian protesters despite heavy repression by the Jordanian monarchy. Then I went into Palestine itself, spent 10 days there, including in the major refugee camps in the West Bank. I visited the border areas of Gaza, saw the bombardment of the Strip with my own eyes. Went to Eilat to assess the effect that the Ansar Allah blockade in the Red Sea was having on this port, a fairly significant port for Israel. Then I went to Lebanon, visited the Bekaa Valley in South Lebanon, spoke with members of the resistance there, interviewed the International Relations Director of Hezbollah, and I also went to Baghdad in Iraq and spoke to members of the resistance there, including people who are involved in opposing Israel's genocide in Gaza. It was my hope, and by the way, you can see all of these reports, they're posted on my YouTube channel. starting from the beginning of March up until about mid-April. It was my hope, as I mentioned in some of these reports, to gain entry into Yemen. I very much wanted to conclude my journey across West Asia there. And I did ultimately, after weeks of waiting, receive a visa from the authorities in Sana'a, whom the West regards as a rebel authority and not as the legitimate government of Yemen, but they control most of the country, including the capital. And this is the authority known as Ansar Allah. It's sometimes referred to as the Houthis in the West, often as the Houthis. But the Houthis are a people, they're not a political movement. The political movement is Ansar Allah. And they did issue to me a visa to enter Yemen. But then once I obtained the visa and tried to purchase a ticket on the Yemeni airline, which is the only airline that flies into Yemen nowadays, I was advised that I would only have a ticket issued to me and could fly into the country if I also got a visa from the Saudi-backed regime and a letter of permission from the Saudis themselves. One may ask, why do the Saudis get to exercise a veto over who can enter what is supposed to be a sovereign country? But that's what I was told, and I'm at the moment trying to figure out how, if at all, I might be able to get those 2 additional authorizations. But at this stage, unfortunately, it's looking as though my chances of entering Yemen are grim, which means I'm going to look at an alternative scenario to conclude my current exploration of the resistance in West Asia. I may go back to Lebanon. Another possibility is that I will visit Iran, but I will make that determination in the days ahead. In terms of why I've undertaken this voyage, I think I can summarize it thus. Although there is tremendously important work being done by civil society in the West, and it's work that has to be done, it's work that in fact needs to be intensified if we're going to bring an end as quickly as possible to this horrific genocide in Gaza. The fact of the matter is that up to this point in time, civil society has not succeeded in meaningfully altering Western government policy towards Israel. Although there has been at times a change in rhetoric and frankly fake expressions of so-called deep concern for the plight of the Palestinian people and the crimes being perpetrated by Israel on the Palestinian civilian population of Gaza and the West Bank, the material, political, and economic support for Israel does not appear to have diminished one iota from the major Western countries, including Canada, where I spend most of my time. In fact, one could say that they have escalated their support for Israel by engaging in ever more brutal forms of repression, of criticism of Israel, not only police beatings of student protesters, peaceful student protesters on campuses across the United States and 2 campuses in Alberta, Canada, but also by vilifying and marginalizing in the most dishonest way the intentions and the tactics being employed by anti-genocide, pro-Palestinian protesters. So when you look realistically, I think the civil society, if it wants to make the maximum contribution to this struggle, it does have to be honest and realistic about what has been achieved thus far. And as important as the work is, and as admirable as the work is, Western government policy has not, in actual fact, changed meaningfully towards Israel since this genocide began. However, what is happening in West Asia is a sea change. Hamas itself has put up, I think it's safe to say, whatever you may think of Hamas, the military reality is that after 7 months of brutal warfare against the civilian population of Gaza and the almost complete obliteration of the Gaza Strip, Hamas continues every day to inflict casualties upon Israel's military. And in fact, within the past 48 hours, Hamas published a slew of videos which gave the impression that, if anything, its resistance to Israeli military operations in Gaza have intensified in the past few weeks. They continue to fire rockets out of the Strip. They continue to engage in combat in parts of the Strip that were supposed to have been conquered by Israel according to its own accounts months ago, for example, northern Gaza. And so Israel has failed miserably, despite its overwhelming advantages in firepower, economic resources, and technological resources, to defeat Hamas. There's no end in sight to the resistance. Of course, it's not just Hamas in the Gaza Strip, it's also Islamic Jihad and other Palestinian militant groups who continue to operate and continue to publish videos of their operations, and Israel continues to acknowledge casualties. For example, a day ago, it acknowledged that one of its soldiers had been killed in an operation in Rafah. Then you have the northern front, the battles taking place between Hezbollah and the Israeli military, and here the failure of the Israeli military to defeat its adversaries is even more obvious. Hezbollah has been launching attacks on military targets and settlements in northern Israel for almost 7 months on a near daily basis, and on most days they launch multiple attacks. And just yesterday the Israeli press reported that Hezbollah had launched its deepest attack into Israel. Most of its attacks, almost all of them, have been within a range of 10 kilometers of the border with Lebanon. And according to Israeli media yesterday, Hezbollah launched an attack 35 kilometers deep at a military intelligence installation in Israel. And the frequency of these attacks seems to be increasing. And so does the damage that Hezbollah is inflicting. There was one incident involving an attack on a command center in a majority Arab village in northern Israel, where some 18 soldiers were killed and wounded. That was just in the past few weeks. And what's most striking about what's happening on the northern front is that despite Hezbollah having effectively depopulated the north of Israel, or at least the areas immediately adjacent to the border, Israel has refrained from launching any kind of a meaningful ground incursion into Lebanon. And I think that this is without precedent in the decades-long history of hostilities between the resistance in Lebanon and Israel. I think the inference that we can draw is that in light of Israel's defeat in South Lebanon in 2006 and the fact that Hezbollah has become much stronger since then, its missile arsenal is much more formidable, and it gained very important combat experience in the war in Syria. I think Israel is more reluctant than ever to engage in extensive ground combat with Hezbollah in South Lebanon, and this is going to pose a real problem for Israel militarily and economically, because the people who live in those communities have been quite clear that they will not go back until the Hezbollah problem has been solved. And finally, of course, you have Iran. Well, I shouldn't say finally. Iran is another one of the members of the axis of resistance, and I think it's fair to say the most important member in terms of its resources, military, economic, and otherwise. And it demonstrated, despite the narrative that we were told about Israel's fabulous air defenses, it demonstrated in its drone and missile attack on Israel that it can strike even the most well-protected military targets in Israel using a relatively small proportion of its massive drone and missile arsenal. And this has got to be of tremendous concern to the Israelis, particularly because it means that their nuclear reactor at Dimona is vulnerable. If Iran can strike any site in Israel, no matter how much air defense is applied to protect it. And then, of course, you have the Ansar Allah movement in Yemen, which, despite having to confront an armada of Western ships, frequent bombardments aerial bombardments by the British and the Americans, continues to strike at ships in the Red Sea, and in fact has increased the range of those strikes and is now striking at vessels, particularly those affiliated with Israel, that are even further afield from the shores of Yemen than was previously the case. There's absolutely no indication, after years of brutal warfare being waged upon Yemen, that the West can defeat Ansar Allah. So all of these various factions of the resistance have proven themselves to be extraordinarily resilient in the face of all of the violence that has been directed at them by Israel and its Western backers. And ultimately what is happening here, my friends, is that Israel is hurtling towards a military defeat in its homeland and in the region of West Asia. And the role, nonetheless, that civil society can play, of course, is to expedite an end to the genocide, to become an additional point of pressure that is applied on Israel. But right now, the main source of weakness for Israel is military in nature and secondarily economic in nature. And ultimately, if civil society can succeed in bringing to an end, at long last, the unconscionable Western support for Israel's criminal regime, that will truly put an end to the apartheid and genocide being inflicted upon the Palestinian people. So ultimately, that's why I've devoted this time and energy to going to the region, trying to understand better what's happening there, particularly the military and economic aspects of it, reporting back to people in the West who are not getting anywhere close to a fulsome and honest picture of the impacts that the resistance is having upon Israel's economy and military, and hopefully by helping to inform the public in the West, make civil society even more effective in terms of opposing this genocide. That's my report for now. This is Dimitri Lascaris coming to you outside the Israeli embassy in Athens, Greece on May 16, 2024.